There was a fork already moving toward that plate when I reached across the table and took it away. The customer stared at me like I had lost my mind. My manager watched the whole thing happen from the other side of the dining room, and she was already walking toward me before I set the plate down. She wanted to know what exactly I thought I was doing. I did not have a clean answer, not one that would have made sense to anyone standing in that room that night. Whatever I had seen in those 4 seconds, I could not explain it yet. Neither could she. But she was about to find out I was right. I tell stories like this every week about people who acted first and explained later. If that feels familiar, stick around and subscribe. Okay, let me walk you through how that night really went. My name is Renee, and at the time all of this happened, I had only been at Marchetti's table for about 3.5 weeks. Marchetti's table was not a fancy restaurant, but it was the kind of place that took itself seriously in a quiet way, the kind of place where the owner still came in twice a week to taste the sauces himself. The dining room sat maybe 50 people on a busy night. Dark wood tables, low gold lighting, the smell of garlic and browned butter drifting out of the kitchen every time the swinging door opened. I had come from a diner 2 towns over, and Marchetti's felt like a different universe. Cloth napkins instead of paper, a wine list instead of a soda machine. I was still learning where everything lived, still double-checking myself before I carried anything heavier than a breadbasket, because I did not want to be the new girl who dropped a tray in front of a table of regulars. The woman who ran the floor was named Carla. Carla had been at Marchetti's for 11 years, and she ran that dining room the way a good conductor runs an orchestra, which is to say, you barely noticed her doing it, but nothing ever fell apart. She was not the kind of manager who yelled. She corrected you once quietly and expected you to remember it forever, and most people did, because getting corrected by Carla felt like disappointing someone who actually believed you were capable of better. She had trained probably 30 servers in her time there, and she had a rule she repeated to every single one of them during their first week. She would say, "The kitchen is never wrong on paper, and you are never right by feeling. Write down what the customer says. Do not guess. Do not improvise. If something seems off, you ask. You do not act." I want you to hold on to that rule, because it matters for what happened next. The night in question was a Thursday, which at Marchetti's was usually a slower night, maybe 30 covers instead of the 50 we would get on a Friday or Saturday. I had 6 tables in my section. Table 9 was a couple, probably somewhere in their 60s, celebrating something. I never found out what. Table 11 on the other side of a low wooden divider that separated my section from Carla's own section that night, since we were short a server, was a solo diner named Mr. Halloway. He came in maybe twice a month, always alone, always ordered the same thing to start, a glass of the house red and the roasted garlic bread, and then took his time deciding on an entree like he was reading a novel instead of a menu. At around 7:40, I was standing near table 11, refilling a water glass for the couple, half listening the way servers do, catching pieces of 3 conversations at once without really processing any of them. And that is when I heard something that, in the moment, meant almost nothing to me. Mr. Halloway was talking to Carla, who had stopped by his table for maybe 90 seconds, just to check on him, the way she did with regulars. And he mentioned, almost as an aside, that his doctor had put him on a new medication a few months back, and that it had done something strange to how his body handled certain foods now, tree nuts specifically, something about a reaction that had gotten worse with age, even though he had eaten those foods his whole life without a problem. Carla nodded, said something reassuring, told him she would let the kitchen know to be careful with his order, and moved on to check another table. I did not write any of that down. It was not my table. It was not directed at me. I was 30 inches away pouring water, and I heard maybe 40% of the actual words. The way you hear a stranger's phone call in a waiting room, present in the room, but not really landing anywhere in your memory as something you need to act on. I finished with the water glass. I moved on to my own tables. I put in an order for table 9. I ran food to table 6. And Mr. Halloway and his tree nut comment disappeared from my mind completely. That is the honest truth of it. I did not walk around the rest of that night thinking about it. I did not flag it for myself as important information I needed to hold on to. Here is where it gets complicated. And here is the part that, later, nobody in that restaurant could fully untangle. Carla had told the kitchen. She had gone straight back after leaving his table and told Danny, one of our line cooks, to make sure Mr. Halloway's dish had no nuts in it because he had mentioned a new sensitivity. Danny wrote it on the ticket himself in blue marker, no nuts, table 11, and clipped it to the rail where the tickets lined up under the heat lamps. That ticket existed. That instruction was given correctly by exactly the person who was supposed to give it, to exactly the person who was supposed to receive it. On paper, in every official sense, table 11 was completely covered. Nobody made a mistake that night in the sense that most people mean when they use that word. Mr. Halloway ended up ordering the pan-seared chicken with a brown butter sauce and a garnish of toasted almond slivers on top, which is one of Marchetti's signature dishes, and normally would have been served exactly as written, almonds and all, because that dish had always had almonds on it, and everyone in that kitchen had made it 100 times without thinking twice. Danny, working fast during a dinner rush that had suddenly picked up more than expected for a Thursday, plated the chicken, saw the ticket note, no nuts, and in the chaos of that moment, made the substitution he was supposed to make. He swapped the almond garnish for a scattering of fried capers instead, which was the kitchen's standard substitute for that dish when someone had a nut allergy. He plated it, called it out, and it went up on the pass. That plate should have been safe. That is the part I need you to understand, because it changes how strange the next 4 seconds actually were. Everyone had done their job. Carla had passed along the information. Danny had made the correct substitution. The ticket backed it up. If you had audited that kitchen afterward, checked every step against every rule, you would have found nothing wrong. And yet, I was walking past the pass on my way to grab drinks for table 9 when I glanced down at that plate sitting under the heat lamp, waiting for whichever server was closest to run it, which, as it happened, was going to be me, since Carla was on the other side of the room and I was standing right there. I looked at that chicken for maybe 1.5 seconds on my way by, not even really looking. The way you glance at a plate 100 times a shift without registering anything specific about it, and something in that glance stopped me. I actually took 2 steps past the pass before my feet turned around and brought me back to it. I picked the plate up and stood there holding it, staring down at the garnish scattered across the top of that chicken, and a feeling moved through me that I still, to this day, find difficult to put into words that would satisfy anyone who was not standing exactly where I was standing. It was not a thought, not really, not a sentence forming in my head that said something is wrong here. It was closer to the feeling you get when you walk into a room and something about the arrangement of furniture has changed before you can name a single object that has moved. My whole body went still, and underneath that stillness was a kind of certainty that did not match anything I could point to yet. I want to be honest with you, because that is the point of this channel, that in that exact moment, standing at the pass with that plate in my hands, I could not have told you why I felt what I felt. I had heard 40% of a conversation about tree nuts 20 minutes earlier that I had not consciously remembered. I had seen a garnish that, as far as I knew, matched exactly what that dish always came out with, Nothing about the plate screamed danger, and yet my hands would not put it down on my tray. I stood there long enough that Danny called over the pass, asking if there was a problem with the ticket, and I said I did not know yet, which was the truest sentence I had spoken all night. That was when I carried the plate, not toward table 11, but toward the small prep counter near the kitchen door, away from anyone who might reach for it, and set it down under the brighter light, there instead of the dimmed lamps over the dining room pass. I leaned in close, closer than any server has any reason to lean over a plate of food, and I started looking at that scattering of dark, wrinkled little pieces sitting across the top of the chicken, the pieces Danny had told himself and told the ticket were fried capers. That is when Carla found me. She had seen the whole thing from across the room, seen me pick up a completed order and carry it away from the pass instead of running it, seen me lean over it at the prep counter like I was examining evidence instead of delivering dinner, and she crossed that dining room faster than I had ever seen her move in 3.5 weeks of watching her work. She reached me right as I straightened up, and the look on her face was not anger exactly. It was something more careful than that. The look of a person trying to figure out, in real time, whether the new girl was about to embarrass the entire restaurant, or whether something had actually gone wrong that she needed to understand immediately. She asked me what exactly I thought I was doing, and I did not have an answer that would have made sense to her. Not yet. All I had was a plate in front of both of us, a customer 40 feet away who had no idea any of this was happening, and a feeling in my chest that would not let go of me, no matter how unreasonable it looked from the outside. Carla did not raise her voice, but she did not need to. She had a way of asking a question so quietly that it made everyone within earshot lean in without meaning to. She asked me again, slower this time, what exactly I thought I was doing carrying a finished plate away from the pass instead of running it to a customer who was waiting on his dinner. Danny had come around from behind the line by then too, wiping his hands on his apron, watching the two of us with the particular unease of a cook who has just been implicitly accused of something without anyone actually saying the word mistake out loud yet. I told her the truth because I did not have anything else to offer her. I said I did not know exactly what was wrong, but that something about the garnish on that plate had stopped me, and that I did not feel right sending it out until I understood what it was. I watched her face while I said it, and I want to describe that expression honestly, because it was not scorn, and it was not patience either. It was the specific, controlled blankness of a person doing rapid math behind their eyes, trying to decide how much time this was worth before it became a problem bigger than one plate of chicken. She looked down at the dish herself then, really looked the way I had looked at it, and for a moment I actually believed she might see whatever I had almost seen, and everything would resolve itself in that instant. But she did not see it. She saw a normal plate of pan-seared chicken with a brown butter sauce, garnished the way it always was, except that instead of almond slivers, there was a scattering of small, dark, wrinkled pieces that any of us who had worked that kitchen for more than a week would have called fried capers without a second thought, because that is exactly what they were supposed to be, and exactly what they look like from 3 feet away under a dim light. Carla straightened up and told me, not unkindly, that the dish looked correct, that Danny had made the appropriate substitution for a customer with a nut sensitivity, and that table 11 had already been waiting close to 9 minutes for an entree that should have gone out immediately. She said that whatever instinct I was having, she respected that I was trying to be careful, but that careful did not mean paralyzed, and that a restaurant could not run on feelings that nobody could explain. She was not wrong to say any of that, I want to be clear about that, because it would be easy to tell this story like she was the obstacle standing between me and the truth, some stubborn authority figure who refused to listen. That is not what this was. Carla had 11 years of experience telling her that a correctly substituted plate, confirmed on the ticket, following a direct verbal instruction she herself had given the kitchen 20 minutes earlier, was a safe plate. Every single thing she knew about how that kitchen worked told her I was overreacting to nothing, and if I had been in her position, watching a 3-week-old server suddenly clutch a finished order like it was a bomb, I probably would have reached the same conclusion she did. She told me to run the plate. I did not move. I know how that sounds. I know that in the moment, refusing a direct instruction from your manager in the middle of a dinner rush over a plate that looked, by every reasonable measure, completely fine, is not a small thing. It is the kind of thing that gets people written up, or worse. And I understood that even as my hands stayed exactly where they were, holding that plate an inch above the counter, instead of lifting it onto my tray, I told her I needed 30 more seconds. I did not explain why. I could not explain why, because I still did not fully know myself what I was looking at, or why it had stopped me. All I knew was that something about the size of those pieces, or the way the light caught them, or some detail I had not consciously identified yet, was pulling at the back of my mind, the same way a word pulls at you when it is sitting right on the tip of your tongue and refuses to surface. Carla's patience, which had already been generous by most standards, began to run out in a way I could see moving across her face like weather. She told me that if I could not explain in the next few seconds what specifically was wrong with that plate, she needed me to trust that the kitchen had done its job correctly and get the food to the table before it went cold and before the customer started wondering why his dinner was taking longer than his appetizer had. And this is where the second thing happened. The thing that, looking back, I think actually saved that night, even though in the moment it felt like the opposite of help. Mr. Holloway, table 11, apparently tired of waiting and unaware that any of this was unfolding 40 feet away near the kitchen door, got up from his seat and started walking toward the front of the restaurant, toward the small hallway that led to the restrooms, which took him directly past the little alcove where Carla and Danny and I were standing over his plate. He saw us. He saw the plate. He asked, with the easy, unbothered tone of someone who has no idea he is standing at the center of anything, whether that was his chicken and whether something was taking longer than usual. Carla, ever composed, ever the professional, told him everything was just fine and that his dinner would be right out. I do not think she was lying to him so much as she genuinely believed at that exact second that this was true. But I found myself speaking before I had decided to speak. I asked him, as normally as I could manage, whether the tree nut reaction he had mentioned earlier applied to all tree nuts, or whether it was specific to certain kinds. I watched Carla's expression shift when I said that, a flicker of something between surprise and irritation, because as far as she knew, I had no reason to be aware that conversation had even happened. I had not been part of it. I had not been told about it directly. And yet, here I was, asking a question that only made sense if I already knew about his allergy, which meant either I had overheard something I was not supposed to have overheard, or something stranger was going on that she had not accounted for. Mr. Holloway, unbothered by any of the tension radiating around him, answered easily. He said the reaction was mostly bad with almonds and walnuts, the ones he had eaten his whole life, but that, oddly enough, cashews did not seem to bother him at all. Some quirk his doctor had mentioned was not unusual with this particular medication interaction, something about the specific proteins involved. I do not think that sentence would have meant anything to almost anyone standing in that hallway. It barely meant anything to me in a fully formed way, even as he said it. But something about it landed differently than it should have, the way a single missing puzzle piece suddenly makes the shape of the whole obvious, even before you have found the piece itself. I looked down at the plate again, at those small, dark, wrinkled pieces scattered across the top of the chicken, and I picked one up between my fingers. It did not feel the way a fried caper feels. I want to slow down here, because this is the detail that mattered, the physical thing underneath the feeling that had been sitting in my chest for the last several minutes without a name. Fried capers, the kind Danny used on that dish, and the kind I had personally garnished probably a dozen plates with, over my 3.5 weeks there, have a very particular texture once they hit hot oil. They crisp on the outside almost like a tiny blistered shell, but they stay slightly moist inside, and they have a certain give to them when you press them between two fingers, a softness at the core. The piece I was holding did not have that give. It was uniformly dry, almost brittle all the way through, with a texture that was closer to something roasted than something fried, and a very faint smell, not unpleasant, but distinct, that I recognized without immediately being able to name, because I had smelled it 100 times before in a completely different context, standing near the dessert station instead of the savory line. Carla was watching me now with an expression that had stopped being irritated and started being something closer to uncertain. Danny had gone quiet completely, no longer defending the plate, just watching along with the rest of us. I held that small, dark piece up to the light, turned it over once, and felt the last piece of that unnamed certainty in my chest finally click into a shape I could almost describe out loud, even though I still did not have the final word for it yet. I asked Danny, as steadily as I could, where the capers for that dish had come from that night, because we had run out of the usual jarred capers 2 nights earlier, and I remembered him mentioning it during side work. His face changed before he said a single word. Danny's face changed before he said a single word. And in a kitchen, that kind of change means something specific. It is the look of a person running back through the last 20 minutes of their own memory at high speed, trying to locate the exact moment where a small decision might have turned into a large problem. He did not answer me right away. He turned instead and walked back through the swinging door toward the line, and Carla and I followed him, still holding that plate, still standing in a kind of frozen triangle around a piece of chicken that none of us fully understood anymore. At the prep station, Danny opened the small container he had used for the garnish that night, and instead of the dark, green, briny smell of capers that should have come from it, we found it nearly empty, except for a scattering of what he now admitted in a voice that had gone flat, with the specific dread of someone realizing a mistake in real time were not capers at all. 2 nights earlier, when we had run out of jarred capers during a Saturday rush, one of the newer prep cooks, a college kid named Theo, who only worked weekends, had been told by the sous chef to improvise a substitute using what we had on hand, something small, dark, and salty enough to mimic the bite of a caper without anyone at the table noticing the difference. Theo, working fast and trying to be resourceful, had used a container of chopped, dry roasted almond pieces left over from a dessert prep earlier that day, tossing them briefly in hot oil with a pinch of salt to darken and crisp them until they visually passed for capers under the low light of the dining room. He had done it once, it had worked, nobody had said anything, and the container had simply been restocked and reused since then without anyone relabeling it or thinking twice, because from 3 feet away, under a heat lamp, a small dark crisped piece of almond and a small dark crisped caper look almost exactly the same. Danny had followed the ticket exactly as it was written. He had removed the visible, obvious almond slivers that were supposed to go on top of that dish, the ones everyone would have recognized instantly as almonds, and replaced them with what he genuinely believed, what every single person in that kitchen believed, was a jar of capers. Nobody had told him that the capers themselves had quietly become almonds 2 nights earlier. The mistake had not happened in that moment. It had happened 2 nights before, in a small, reasonable, resourceful decision that nobody thought was worth mentioning to anyone, and it had been sitting there ever since, waiting for exactly the wrong ticket to come along. I remember standing there in that narrow space behind the line, the plate still in my hands, and feeling something that was not triumph, not even relief, yet but a kind of cold, sinking clarity, the specific feeling of watching a shape you could not name finally resolve itself into something you recognize, and realizing at the same moment how close it had come to being too late to matter. If I had run that plate to table 11, the way Carla had asked me to, the way any reasonable server would have, Mr. Holloway would have eaten a garnish he believed was capers, made entirely of the one thing his own doctor had specifically warned him about only weeks earlier. Carla had gone very still beside me. I want to describe her reaction honestly, because she did not throw her hands up or apologize dramatically or make a scene out of it, and that restraint told me something about who she actually was underneath the authority of her position. She looked at the almost empty container, then at the plate, then at me, and I watched her go through the exact same process I had gone through a few minutes earlier, taking a scattered handful of small details and assembling them in real time into a shape that suddenly made complete and terrible sense. But we were not finished yet, because knowing what had happened and undoing it were 2 different problems. And there was still a hungry customer sitting at table 11 who had no idea how close he had just come to a very bad night. And there was still the question of what exactly Carla was going to do with a new server who had just refused a direct order in front of the kitchen staff, even though that refusal had turned out to be right. This is the part of the story I still think about more than almost any other part. And I think some of you watching this will recognize the feeling, even if you have never worked in a restaurant a single day in your life. It is that particular suspended moment after you have been proven right, but before anyone has actually said so out loud, when you are standing in a room with the person who doubted you, and neither of you has figured out yet what happens next. I have talked to so many of you in the comments on other videos about moments just like this one, the ones where you knew something before you could prove it, and I am curious this time whether any of you have ever been on the other side of that moment, instead, the one standing there realizing you were about to tell someone they were wrong when they were actually right. If that has ever happened to you, I would really like to hear about it below, because I do not think enough people talk about what that particular kind of humility feels like from the inside. Carla set the container down on the counter and turned to Danny first, not to blame him, but to ask him, calmly, to prep a completely new plate for table 11 from scratch, no garnish at all until they could confirm exactly what was safe, and to pull every remaining piece of that almond and oil mixture out of the kitchen immediately and label the container correctly, or better yet, throw it out entirely and start fresh with real capers from a new jar. Danny moved fast, the way people move when they are trying to fix something instead of talking about it, and within a minute, there was a new ticket up on the rail and a new plate coming together, plain, careful, correct. Then Carla turned to me. She did not apologize right away. and I do not think I expected her to. What she did instead was ask me, quietly, almost like she was talking to herself as much as to me, how I had known, not accusingly, genuinely. She wanted to understand the mechanism of it, the same way I had wanted to understand the texture of that almond piece between my fingers a few minutes earlier. And I told her honestly that I had not known, not in any way I could have explained to her before I picked that plate up. I told her about overhearing the tail end of her conversation with Mr. Halloway without meaning to, about how it had not even registered as something important at the time, about the strange stillness that came over me when I glanced at the plate at the pass, about the texture of the garnish that did not match what a caper should feel like, about the smell that I recognized without immediately placing, and about the detail that finally tied it together, the fact that we had run out of capers 2 nights earlier, and I remembered Danny mentioning it during side work, which meant whatever was on that container now had come from somewhere else. Carla listened to all of it without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking down at the almost empty container sitting on the counter between us, like it was evidence in a case that had almost gone very differently. She said, finally, that she had told me to run that plate. She said it plainly, not as an accusation against herself, but almost like she needed to hear the sentence out loud to fully understand the size of what had almost happened under her own direct instruction. I told her that she had made the right call with the information she had. I meant it. I still mean it. Everything she knew in that moment. The ticket, the substitution, her own conversation with the customer, her 11 years of experience running that kitchen without an incident like this. All of it pointed to a safe plate. She had not been careless. She had been reasonable, and reasonable had almost not been enough. She did not say much more to me right then, because the new plate was ready, and table 11 had now been waiting almost 15 minutes for his dinner, and there was a restaurant full of other tables that still needed attending to. She picked up the new plate herself, walked it out to Mr. Halloway personally, and I watched from near the kitchen door as she crouched slightly beside his table, said something quiet to him that I could not hear, something that made his easy, unbothered expression shift into something more serious, more grateful, as he looked down at his plate and then back up at her, with an expression I did not fully understand yet from that distance. I stayed in the back for a few minutes after that, half expecting to be pulled aside the moment the dinner rush eased up, and half expecting that conversation to go very differently than the ones Carla usually had with servers, who had shown her up in front of the kitchen staff. I did not know yet whether what I had just done was going to be remembered as the moment I proved myself at Marchetti's table, or the moment that ended my 3.5 weeks there, before I ever got the chance to become anything more than the new girl who had frozen at the pass and refused a direct order over a feeling she could not explain. The dinner rush at Marchetti's table did not stop for what had just happened, and in a strange way, I think that worked in my favor, because it meant nobody had time to sit down and turn the moment into something bigger than it needed to be right away. Carla came back from table 11 a few minutes later, and instead of pulling me into the small office behind the kitchen the way I had braced myself for, she simply told me to get back on the floor, that table 9 still needed their check, and table 6 had been asking about dessert for 5 minutes. She said it in the same even, practical tone she used for every other instruction that night, and for a moment, I genuinely could not tell whether that meant everything was fine or whether she was simply waiting until closing to deal with it properly. I want to be honest that not knowing was its own kind of exhausting. I spent the rest of that dinner service running food and refilling glasses with my mind only half present, replaying the last 20 minutes over and over, wondering if I had just proven something to her or embarrassed myself in a way that would follow me for the rest of my time there, however long that turned out to be. It was not until close to 10:30, after the last table had paid and the kitchen had started breaking down for the night, that Carla found me again. I was rolling silverware into napkins at the server station near the back, a task that exists mostly to give you something to do with your hands while you wait for a shift to officially end, and she pulled up the stool next to me and sat down, which she almost never did during a shift, since Carla was not someone who sat while there was still work happening around her. She asked me to walk her through the whole thing again, slower this time, from the very beginning, starting with the moment I had overheard her talking to Mr. Halloway. I told her again, in more detail, because now that the danger had passed, I had the space to actually think clearly about the sequence of it instead of just reacting to it. I told her that I did not think what I had felt at the pass was some kind of special instinct or gift, and I meant that. I told her I thought my brain had simply picked up a piece of information it did not know what to do with yet. A stray comment about tree nuts, filed it away somewhere I was not consciously aware of, and then, when my eyes landed on that garnish, something underneath my conscious thinking recognized a mismatch before the rest of me could explain why. I told her it had felt less like knowing and more like my body refusing to move until my mind caught up with something it already suspected. Carla nodded slowly at that, and then she told me something I did not expect, which was that in her 11 years at Marchetti's, this was not actually the first time something like this had happened, just the first time it had happened to her personally, instead of to someone she had heard about secondhand from other restaurants over the years. She said every experienced server she had ever trained eventually developed some version of what I was describing, a kind of pattern recognition built entirely out of repetition. Thousands of small moments of watching plates and customers and tickets align correctly, until the rare moment when something did not align and the mind noticed the gap before it could name it. She said the difference was that most people needed years to build that instinct, and I had apparently built a fragment of it in 3.5 weeks, which she suspected had less to do with any special ability and more to do with the fact that I happened to be standing in exactly the right place, at exactly the right moment, having overheard exactly the right sentence, close enough in time to the plate itself that the connection had not yet faded from memory. I appreciated that she did not try to make it sound mystical, because I do not think it was. I think what happened that night was closer to a coincidence of attention than anything else, a small window where a piece of overheard information happened to still be sitting somewhere accessible in my mind at the exact moment I needed it, instead of having already been pushed out by the next 40 things that happened during a dinner shift. But I also think that coincidence only mattered because I let it stop me instead of talking myself out of it, and that part, at least, felt like something I could actually take credit for. Then Carla said the thing I had been waiting all night to hear, whether I fully realized I was waiting for it or not. She told me that she had been wrong to tell me to run that plate, and that she wanted me to understand she was not saying that lightly, because in her experience, admitting a mistake out loud to a 3.5-week employee was not something she did often or comfortably. She said that everything she had known in that moment had told her the dish was safe, and that a manager who second-guessed every experienced cook every time a new server hesitated would never get a single plate out of that kitchen on time, so she did not regret the instinct behind her decision. But she said the outcome mattered more than the reasoning behind it, and the outcome was that I had been right and she had been wrong, and she did not think there was any dignity in pretending otherwise, just because her initial call had been reasonable. I did not expect to feel emotional hearing that, but I did in a quiet, controlled way that I tried not to let show too much on my face, because I did not want to make the moment bigger than it already was for either of us. I told her I had genuinely thought, at several points that night, that I might be fired for refusing her instruction, regardless of how it turned out. She looked at me for a moment, with an expression I had not seen from her before, something almost surprised, and told me that if I had been wrong, if that plate had turned out to be exactly what it appeared to be, and I had simply delayed service over nothing, we would be having a very different conversation right now, one about trusting the kitchen and not letting nerves get in the way of doing the job. But she said that was precisely why what happened mattered so much, because I had been willing to risk that outcome, willing to actually hold my ground long enough to find out whether I was right, instead of caving the moment she pushed back on me, which most new employees would have done immediately. She told me that Mr. Halloway, when she brought him the corrected plate, had asked her directly what had happened to make service take so long, and she had told him honestly, because she said she did not believe in lying to a customer about something that serious, even to save the restaurant an awkward moment. She said he had gone quiet for a few seconds after she explained it, and then had simply said that he appreciated her telling him the truth about it, and that he understood these things happen in kitchens, and that the delay was nothing compared to what could have happened otherwise. She said he tipped generously that night, though she was careful to say that was not the part of the story that mattered to her. What mattered to her, she said, sitting there on that stool at almost 11 at night, with the restaurant emptied out around us, was that somewhere in the last several weeks, without either of us fully noticing it happening, I had apparently learned to pay attention to this restaurant, the way she needed every server on her floor to pay attention to it, and that she did not think that could be taught directly, only demonstrated by watching someone do it once under real pressure. She said she planned to tell Theo, the weekend prep cook, exactly what had happened, not to punish him, since what he had done 2 nights earlier had been a reasonable improvisation under pressure, the same kind of reasonable decision she herself had made that night, but so that the container would be properly labeled going forward, and so he would understand why a small, unlabeled substitution, however sensible it seemed at the time, could sit quietly in a kitchen for days before finding the one ticket it was never meant to meet. I asked her, because I genuinely wanted to know whether she was going to mention any of this to the owner. She said she was, because she believed in transparency about mistakes in her kitchen, hers included, but she said she was also going to mention specifically what I had done, not as an aside, but as the actual point of the story she planned to tell him. She said, most managers, when something like this happens, tend to remember the danger and forget the person who caught it, and she did not want to be the kind of manager who did that. I did not think much more about that conversation for the rest of that week, mostly because Marchetti's did not slow down long enough to let anyone dwell on anything for very long. But the following Tuesday, when the owner came in for his usual midweek visit to taste the sauces, he asked to speak with me before I clocked in for my shift. His name was Mr. Marchetti himself, an older man who had built that restaurant from a single rented kitchen 22 years earlier, and who by that point mostly stayed out of the daily running of the floor, trusting Carla with almost everything. I had spoken to him maybe twice in my 3.5 weeks there, both times briefly, both times about nothing more significant than whether the specials board needed updating. He asked me to walk with him to the small office behind the kitchen, and I will admit that even though I had done nothing wrong, some old instinct still made my stomach tighten a little at being asked into that office by the owner of the restaurant. he sat down across from me, folded his hands on the desk, and told me that Carla had described the entire evening to him in detail, and that he wanted to hear a few things directly from me before he decided how he wanted to handle it. I told him the same version of events I had told Carla, plainly, without exaggerating any part of it, because I did not think it needed exaggerating to matter. He listened without interrupting, the way Carla had, and when I finished, he asked me one specific question that none of us had thought to fully resolve that night in the rush of everything else happening. He asked whether the almond piece I had picked up and examined, the one that had confirmed what I already suspected, still existed anywhere, because he wanted, for his own records and for the sake of thoroughness, an actual physical sample of what had gone out on that garnish, not just an account of what people remembered seeing. It turned out that it did still exist. When Danny had pulled the container off the line that night, instead of throwing it away immediately in the chaos of trying to fix the plate, he had, almost by instinct, set it aside in a small, covered container in the walk-in refrigerator, the way any cook trained to be careful about liability does when something goes wrong in a kitchen, preserving the evidence rather than disposing of it before anyone official had seen it. Mr. Marchetti had one of the kitchen staff bring that container into the office, and he opened it himself right there at the desk and looked down at maybe a dozen small, dark, crisped pieces sitting inside it, indistinguishable at a glance from capers, exactly as they had looked under the heat lamp that night. He picked one up, turned it over the way I had, and pressed it between his fingers. He did not say anything for a moment. Then he asked whether I would be willing to show him exactly what I had noticed, the specific texture, the specific gev, comparing it against an actual caper from an unopened jar in the kitchen. I said yes, and we walked out to the line together, where Danny, looking somewhat nervous to have the owner standing at his station, opened a fresh jar of real capers. Mr. Marchetti pressed one between his fingers, then went back to the container and pressed one of the almond pieces again, back and forth twice, comparing the two directly the way I had done instinctively that night, without anyone watching. I watched his face while he did it, and I saw the exact moment the difference became obvious to him too. The slight give of the real caper against the dry brittleness of the almond, a difference so small that under a heat lamp from 3 feet away, it had fooled an experienced manager and an experienced cook, but that up close, between 2 fingers, was completely unmistakable once you knew to look for it. He set both pieces down on a small plate on the counter, side by side, and looked at them for a long moment before looking back up at me. He said that in 22 years of running that restaurant, he had seen plenty of near misses get caught by luck, a customer mentioning an allergy twice, a cook double-checking a ticket out of habit, but he said he could not remember a single instance where a mistake 2 nights old, buried inside a mislabeled container, had been caught by someone noticing a texture difference between 2 fingers before the plate ever reached the table. He said that was not luck. He said luck does not hold its ground against a manager telling you to move faster. He asked Carla, who had come to stand in the kitchen doorway by then, whether she agreed, and she said that she did without hesitation, which surprised me a little, given how carefully measured she usually was with her words. What happened after that was not dramatic, and I think that is exactly why it stayed with me the way it did. Mr. Marchetti did not make an announcement to the whole staff. He did not put anything on a plaque or mention it during a pre-shift meeting. He simply told Carla in front of me that going forward, any ingredient substitution made in that kitchen, however sensible it seemed in the moment, needed to be written down and labeled the same day it was made, no exceptions, and that this new rule existed because of what had happened that Thursday, though he did not need to explain to anyone exactly why. And he told me, before he left the kitchen that day, that he had asked Carla to move me, whenever I felt ready, off the standard new hire schedule and onto the same rotation as the more experienced servers, the ones who worked the tables closest to the kitchen, the ones trusted to notice things quickly, because that was apparently where he wanted someone with my particular habit of paying attention. I did not get a raise that day, and nobody threw me a party, and Mr. Halloway, as far as I know, never learned exactly how close that night had come to going differently, only that his dinner had been delayed and remade out of an abundance of caution. But 2 weeks later, when I came in for a Thursday shift, I found my name written on the schedule next to table 11 in Carla's handwriting, in the section she reserved for her most trusted servers, and next to it, in smaller letters, she had written a single word that she never explained to me, and that I never asked her to explain, because I already understood exactly what it meant. The word was simply capers. If a story like this one meant something to you, I put up a new one every week about ordinary people who paid a real price for trusting what they knew before anyone else believed them. I will see you in the next one.